This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. So hello, everyone. Today's guest needs no introduction to sovereign debt nerds. Anna Gelpern is a professor at Georgetown Law and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. But many of us know her as a key contributor of the blog Credit Slips and an organizer of my favorite conference, DebtCon, which is now in its 5th season. Is that right? Yeah. So Anna, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Jill, thank you so much for having me. I love this podcast, and thank you for mentioning all the crazy sovereign debt capers. We're having the 5th season of DebtCon. Feels like a sitcom, doesn't it? Is in Florence. It's more limited than we'd like to do in person. But there are also online sessions in Morocco, and we are hoping another one. And so we're sort of trying to take advantage of our new capacity to do mixed format. I really can't wait to just get back together in the festival atmosphere that
with the non-permanent tattoos.
Yes,
yeah, we have to have the tattoos.
You know what? Actually, that's a really good point, because the tattoos we can ship far and wide, no matter what the COVID protocols.
Exactly, we can download them somehow.
Brilliant. Okay, so while supply chains permitting, you will have some mix of debt nerddom and temporary tattoos.
Awesome. So to get into it, I mean, there is like no limit of what you and I could be talking about today. And I'm tempted to get sidetracked on Russia and Ukraine and the common framework, and I don't know, probably a dozen other things. So you just have to, first of all, promise you'll come back to talk about those things. But today, I really wanted to focus on your very interesting work published last year on how China lends. You and your co-authors looked into, I think it was 100 debt contracts between Chinese entities and about 25 developing countries throughout the world. And it's one of the few really out there that I know of that is really kind of going into the actual weeds of the contracts and really looking very specifically and without all of the rhetoric and politicization of it. So can you first tell me how this study came about and how did you get access to these contracts? Because one of the big issues is about transparency, isn't it?
So, well, Jill, first, thank you again. And let's hope we get a fraction of the way into the high expectations you set up. This project very appropriately actually came out of the last big in-person DebtCon, where we try to bring together people from different disciplines and also from practice as well as the academy, so that, I mean, this is really the one thing that we sort of insist on in the context of putting this conference together. And this is the one time that I feel like it just paid off beautifully. So one of my co-authors participated in a panel on Chinese lending, among other things, I think. And so this was Scott Morris. He, in turn, was working with Brad Parks at Aid Data, whose group is entirely responsible for collecting the contract. So all credit to them. I mean, they really have basically an army of internet sleuths who just locate these, usually actually on legislative websites, interestingly enough, but like there's an extra layer to getting this information, which is, we discussed before, sort of my pet peeve. This should be as easy to find as the route to CVS. And it so happens that they got 100 contracts by the time we were ready to close the project and really release the analysis. So 100 is purely an accident. That there was thought that it was 101 at one point. And then Christoph Trebisch I've worked with on most recently on a chapter on sovereign default in an IMF handbook that you and I both contributed to. And then he was working with Sebastian Horn, and they had done some quantitative work. So really we had economists, political scientists, a policy practitioner, and I was sort of the lawyer in the group. The question that started it all was, Scott and Brad and I were talking, and they asked, well, is what we found, how does that compare to the international norm? And they had a very impolite guffaw because what international norm? Particularly in bilateral official lending, there really isn't very much transparency, and the norms are very hard to discern, and that is a very generous way of describing the state of play. So it's gotten somewhat better of late, but it's really, so this question of how does China compare to the rest of the world against the background of ever louder debate about whether Chinese lending is good, bad, benevolent or imperialist, just a very politically inflected debate, I think, that you referred to. That was in the background, but the research question is really compared to what?
Compared to what? Well, because that's kind of immediately getting to one of the key questions, right? Which is what entities are lending, and how China makes a distinction between the various entities. So between China Exim Bank, which is their official export credit agency, or China Development Bank, which they see more as a kind of commercial entity, although government owned. So that already, when you're starting to kind of gather a contract, and because the contracts that you gathered encompassed all of these different sorts of entities.
So by volume, it was China Development Bank. By number, it was Exim. And then there were a number of other state banks and state agencies. But really, I think, 70 something.
Because if you're comparing, you want to try to see, like you're saying, kind of apples to apples.
Well,
which is hard because they're Chinese apples.
Well, right. And look, we're basically, we have a classification system for both institutions and contracts that, has a category for meat, a category for potatoes, and a category for apples. And we're somehow trying to fit, grapes, flies into that. And
exactly, something that's just totally different, right? Because they've developed institutions that don't actually conform to our definitions.
Well, and why should they, right? It's not sort of an arbitrage development, but it does present some arbitrage opportunities, and I want to go back to that. So the way we did it, and this is another fortuitous bit, at the time, there was one country, Cameroon, that we identified that had posted all of its project-related debt contracts in one place. And that included, that benchmark set included, stuff that's identifiably meat and potatoes, right? So it included borrowing from established Paris Club creditors, established official bilateral debt, multilateral debt, and commercial debt from commercial banks. And also took the Loan Market Association template for this particular kind of contract and used that both as a baseline and as to help us frame the categories for comparison, so that really we could answer the question, how does this compare to official bilateral debt, commercial debt? Not surprisingly, it's a bit of both. So the good news is that it wasn't, meat, potatoes, apples, and elephants. It was meat, potatoes, apples, and grapes, right? So it was sort of broadly in the same category, but it was very different. It was different in important respects. And I guess the other thing I would flag is that it's fair, I think, to consider the comparator that so both sides in this political debate are suggesting. So if the claim is that China Development Bank lending is commercial, we do have a number of commercial comparisons. The claim is that it's development lending, then we have development lending comparisons. And then if the claim is that it is closest to export credit, then we have that too, right? So in China, EXIM is complicated because it's they also describe it as a development institution, right? And that's sort of one of those things that,
it just doesn't fit.
Like is separate. But, it's one thing to say something is hybrid. It's another thing to say it's, from an alien planet. And I think what we found a lot more hybrid than alien.
Right. I picked up on one phrase that you used kind of even early on in the paper, but it says the difference was in degrees, not in kind. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at, was that it was somewhat similar to what we are used to seeing from other lenders, not completely different, but different to a degree.
Absolutely.
So
yeah. And there was really only one clause that just had no reference point in any other agreements, and that's the so-called, what we call the No Paris Club clause. Honestly, it's a shorthand that just kind of took. It's not entirely descriptive because it really is about no restructuring.
No coordinated
restructuring, exactly.
Restructuring. I'm gonna put a pin on that one because I want to come back to that, because I think that's somewhat of a dated question that maybe life has kind of moved on from there. But I want to go back and in the paper you've stated kind of three major findings, which in my shorthand I just put it as confidentiality, collateral, and consolation, right? So in the confidentiality, I think in today's world, like today, the way we're referring to all of this is transparency, or the kind of lack of transparency. I was just on a webinar, I think a day or 2 days ago, it's all a blur, but where the World Bank economists and several issuing countries, debtor countries, were discussing transparency and how this is particularly difficult because China's lending entities, whichever one, puts these very stringent restrictions on the borrower, basically restricting them from disclosing even the existence sometimes of the debt, never mind the terms and conditions. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and if it's fair, how does a country combat that, or is how legally binding is that clause?
This is something that really tends to come up a lot in conversations between lawyers and economists in particular. Just because a contract says something doesn't mean that this is what's going to happen, right? So a contract could have any number of functions, including it's a starting point for negotiation. It plays some sort of an expressive role. Don't even think about it, that kind of thing, right? There are a bunch of completely unenforceable non-competes that in low wage industries where people seem to think they're enforceable and therefore end up unemployable, even though they're completely unenforceable. So, I mean, this is an aside that's probably to cut.
Okay.
These confidentiality terms, we have some evidence that Chinese lenders do at least complain, threaten to enforce them, but how enforcement would work is hard to predict. And I think that holds for a lot of these clauses. The question really is what incentives it sets up and what kind of cover it gives to parties that may not actually be particularly eager to disclose, right? So
On either side.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that a lot of these agreements have a lot of the officials entering into these agreements on all sides, and not just in China, but in other countries, and several G7 come to mind, are not terribly excited to have these contracts publicized anywhere. So that, and some of this is legitimate because, national security and, but even if you take out all the contracts that have direct bearing on national security concerns, you have a giant world of undisclosed contracts that pose all kinds of problems, right? So with that said, Chinese entities, and in particular China Exim, have a very unusual confidentiality provision.
And just to be clear, that's going back to this comparing apples to apples. It's unusual when compared to other export credit agencies
and private and everybody. Like
everybody.
it is.
Okay.
So, and
it just goes way beyond.
Yeah. Right. So,
Okay.
And including, by the way, compared to China Development Bank. So that's, I mean, I'll show you, I can show you I can show you the term, but for commercial creditors, the bulk of the confidentiality obligation is on the lender, which makes an enormous amount of sense because the lender is the one, prowling around doing due diligence on the borrower.
Right.
And so the borrower would be rightly concerned that the lender is going to, share their trade secrets with competitors. Whereas really the only obligation on the borrower in the LMA template and in the commercial loans that we've seen is not to disclose the funding rates of the banks, right? Whereas China Exim says the borrower shall keep all the terms, conditions, standard of fees hereunder, or in connection with this agreement, strictly confidential. Without prior consent of the lender, the borrower shall not disclose any information hereunder or in connection with, really broad, this agreement to any third party. I'm not sure whether third party, interestingly, includes the legislature, for example, unless required by applicable law. Now, unless is arguably a big carve out.
Right, because I was just going to say that, I mean, borrower countries would say, to international organizations that are pushing for greater transparency and global database of lending and all of these things, that they would, I mean, they have a case to say we can't comply because the terms of our borrowing inhibit us from sharing that information. And then they go one step further, like I heard on this webinar just the other day, saying we need your help, the rest of the official community, to either pass rules or laws or help us in kind of the fight for transparency. If you want this to happen, you have to support us in that effort. Is that fair?
So it's very partly fair. So is it fair that they need help? Absolutely. Is it fair to say, well, gosh golly, I have this promise and I can't do anything about it. Well, like promises are held until they're broken. And this is not a universe. The universe that you and I have been talking about all these years is not a universe where every promise is kept pristine. And this seems to be one that is, A, kind of hard enough to enforce, and B, one that is pretty easy to get around with domestic measures.
Okay, so putting the domestic, but I think the argument from borrowing countries is, well, if we upset this creditor, they might not come back for more. So, like, we don't really want to break a promise or not,
but
take the oath of silence.
Right. I mean, that's a relational point. That's not a legal point.
Right.
What can the international community do? Does a Paris Club principle, does a Paris Club disclosure requirement count as applicable law? Yeah, it's law at best. I sort of doubt it. Does IMF conditionality count? Again, I think it's, it's something of a stretch, right? So the very best outcome would be if G20 ever G20 again, for them to say, we as the international community commit not to include these terms in any agreements that we or any entities we control conclude with sovereign borrowers, and we commit not to enforce them in the contracts we already have, right? Just because you have a right doesn't commit you to enforcing the right. As far as I'm concerned, that would be super helpful. But, given the current state of the G20, I'm holding my breath.
So then it comes down to the borrower having domestic law. You're saying saying,
I think that
we would unilaterally pass, our own law in our own country, saying that all debt contracts are transparent or published on our website or something.
Right. And I mean, that's where all the contracts we found come from, legislative websites. Right. And, legislation is kind of unilateral. We don't really consult with other countries before authorizing legislation for debt issue.
But if it complicates the future borrowing, but maybe, I don't know, maybe you have a view on whether this clause, and we'll get into some of the others, is so essential that it would actually change the lending practices of the Chinese entity.
If I'm thinking about it from the creditor perspective, and again, I think the issue is really a lot more relational than legal. It is so much more harmful to have this stuff come out piecemeal, out of context. There's a contract in the database where both Ecuador and the Chinese lender to Ecuador promise to keep one provision only confidential, and that's choice of law and dispute resolution in London, because it's politically embarrassing.
Right.
But it's way more embarrassing to have this stuff leak out, and that's not even the most embarrassing. I think that we need to get to a place where the presumption is disclosure, and confidentiality, particularly of the expansive sort that we're talking about, is a rare exception. And I actually think that this would be good for both lenders and borrowers, and it would be terrific for the markets.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps other creditors, for sure. I mean, and particularly, as we know, in a debt restructuring scenario where you just have to know what's in the books and who's in line to get paid, and where do you stand in that line vis-a-vis others.
Amen. So, right. And I mean, when did it get to be okay to, discover that 10% of GDP in debt just suddenly materializes the day before or after default? Like, that's not okay. Not for the debtor, not for the creditor, not for the people.
Right.
It's, I'm not a transparency fundamentalist. I feel like I'm a transparency pragmatist, but we're so far away from what I think should be the norm. And the excuses are so, divorced from common sense, I guess. I was in a forum where a debtor said, "Oh, we'd love to disclose, but our creditors won't let us." And then the creditor says, "Oh, we'd love to disclose, but we need the debtor's consent."
Well, I do kind of feel like everyone's just pointing fingers in different directions. Let's assume that the borrower wants to disclose, but is really rightly or wrongly fearful that this would affect future borrowing. And they don't want to take that unilateral domestic action, let's just say. And they are pushing for help from, I take your point on the G20, let's just say G7 right now.
International community, whoever they are.
International community, vaguely, exactly. Let's not get specific, right? If they're asking for that G7 or international community for that support, in your research, are those other creditors, official creditors, transparent to a degree that they would be willing? Let's not point fingers at anyone, but are other non-Chinese entities, let's just say other official bilateral creditors, Paris Club or otherwise, are they normally transparent in their lending?
No, right? I mean, there's, the sort of, and it is so really the ones that are very transparent or impressively transparent are the multilaterals, including AIIB, by the way, that publish their terms and conditions. Among the bilaterals, the Japan International Cooperation Agency is one of the few that publishes its standard terms. And remember, publish your standard terms, your general terms, that already is super helpful, because when the borrower is coming to negotiate the loan, they can see what the norm is.
Right, they have some benchmark.
Exactly. When somebody's asking for more than, or when they're trying to get less than, that it's in context, right? So let's start by publishing the baseline, the general terms and conditions, which is what the the World Bank, the AIIB, the JICA publish. I would argue for more. And so, look, I mean, I would argue for all creditors publishing their general terms and conditions, and for all debtors disclosing at a minimum to their, the legislature, whatever deliberative body would, provide the most accountability in this context, the contracts, preferably before they're entered into. I can see how that can create, certain sensitivities and frictions, but even knowing that the full contract would be disclosed after it's entered into would exert a discipline of sorts, right? I don't think it's just the creditors. I don't think it's just the debtors. It is absolutely not just China. But this is my point earlier, which is that it's not, contracts tell us something, and contracts give some people some cover, but transparency is far broader than contracts. And, I would never buy I'm sorry, I can't do it, I have a contract.
Right.
That's what bankruptcy's for. An organized way of breaking contracts.
So moving on to the second kind of question about collateral. So you also found in your paper that the collateral arrangements in Chinese lending, generally speaking, were particular, and to say the least. And this is normally around oil, mineral, other resource-based lending. We've seen it a ton in Venezuela, Ecuador, Zambia. I mean, the list just goes on. It's all over. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what you found in that, again, and kind of the idea that this how different is this from other lending practices from other entities? Is this, I mean, it might be concerning in the just a sense of the volume. And again, combined with the lack of transparency, that would greatly inhibit a restructuring, because if the resources of the country are all tied up in kind of other contracts, then the country basically doesn't have the capacity to earn foreign currency to pay other lenders. But can you just kind of touch on the collateral findings?
Sure. And this one actually is quite apart from the policy aspects. It's kind of nerd heaven. It makes an enormous amount of sense commercially, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
it is not standard. So let me explain. The first set of clauses we talked about, confidentiality clauses, are in this bucket of clauses that have the same kind of general heading as the norm, but have rather different contents. This particular set of clauses, so we're looking for the most part at revenue accounts, repayment accounts. These are quite common in project financing, but in limited recourse project financing. In full recourse sovereign lending, they're unusual. Who happen, and we have some examples of other countries and multilaterals using them, but they're very rare. Whereas they are quite common in the sample of Chinese loans that we have. So that creates the kinds of problems you described, which is resources are tied up. If there is a layer of confidentiality on top of this, we really don't know how they're tied up or how much of the resource flow is tied up. I think here it's important to highlight that we don't have the security agreements. We just have the loan agreements that tell us that there are security agreements. So there's a lot that we don't know. And this is terribly important because for example, all the multilaterals and all commercial creditors have rather expansive negative pledge clauses, right, that promise not to take on a secured debt. And if they do take on secured debt, to secure prior creditors pro rata. Those clauses are very heterogeneous. They vary a lot among creditors. They have giant loopholes or, exceptions, exclusions, so that it's kind of hard to say, well, this is an obvious violation of fill in the blank negative pledge clause. But the spirit, certainly, of these arrangements is to give extra repayment security to one creditor in a world where there is a finite pool of foreign currency revenue. From my perspective, and again, going back to transparency. So the mechanism is revenues flow into an account, and there's a minimum balance requirement in the account, and that is really the collateral, if you will. And some of the arrangements we've seen in other countries, are more, have bigger minima, right? So it's not, I have no information to suggest that China locks up more resources. But what I don't know is control over flows, right? So if all the flows are supposed to go through an institution that is controlled by the lender, or maybe even is in the territory of the lender, right? And a lot more might be exposed to freezing and seizure. I mean, actually stuff that we really think a lot more about today than we did a year ago.
Because a lot of these financial transactions are all like structured so that they're happening in China, that the accounts are all there, or not really?
We don't know enough to say that.
Okay.
We know that some of it is. We don't have enough. So we could also be, for example, a branch of, or a sub of a Chinese institution in London, for example, right? I don't have enough confidence in the location of all of these and so the jurisdiction question, right? The way I would think about it, who can actually grab and freeze and seize this stuff?
Which, like you said, is incredibly poignant in today's world.
Precisely, right? So like we know today that the power that has control over flows has tremendous negotiating leverage in economic, financial, and political realms. And we just need to know a lot more. We need more content here, right? We need to understand how much of the borrower's revenue flow is actually tied up in these kinds of arrangements. And this also goes back to again, the confidentiality, but also, interestingly, other types of provisions that we may or may not have time to get to, which is, so you might take a provision that is really not terribly enforceable in court. Put aside this question of whether those no Paris Club clauses are even a live issue now if China's committed to participate in the common framework, for example, right? Let's assume that away for a moment. But it's sort of a goofy clause to begin with, because if your borrower is not paying you and is trying to coordinate a restructuring, are you going to sue them for not paying you or for trying to coordinate a restructuring? Right. So whereas paying you, why on earth would you sue them to begin with? Like, let them coordinate the restructuring, and so long as they keep paying, it's not your problem. So, but in a world where you've got this self-enforcing mechanism, which is control over financial flows, then you don't have to go to court. You don't have to ask anybody, well, gee, is this a breach or is this not a breach? You automatically have very powerful tools to pressure the debtor with or without a court's involvement. And I think there's some vulnerability.
And that's where other creditors, again, will be most sensitive.
Right. And my biggest concern is everybody else is going to want the same thing. So we're going to have this terrible race to the bottom where everybody's going to want a piece of a revenue account, and everybody's going to want, to get their hands on some commodities the minute the wind blows in the wrong direction. So that's terrible for the most vulnerable countries at the time when they have, when they're most stretched, right, to deal with a whole bunch of these different problems. That would be my concern.
We just touched on some of the cancellation kind of issues, but when we mention the common framework and kind of where we are in right now with countries being very vulnerable in high debt distress, the impact of the pandemic, needs to address climate change and the like, we're likely going to be seeing a lot more sovereign debt restructurings, or at least coordinated negotiations and discussions. From your research, and maybe this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But from your perspective, I mean, China has indicated, or has participated rather, in the DSSI and has stepped forward for the common framework. The three cases that we have in the common framework haven't gone very well. There is talk of perhaps expanding it. There's talks of kind of rethinking it. Do you see that as kind of a change for China in its lending practices going forward, and its willingness or to forego some of these clauses that they've put in previous lending, and kind of a change of attitude? Like, what are your thoughts? It's a very broad, open-ended question, but like I said,
broad, open-ended, love it. Well, so unlike some of our mutual friends, I was a very early and bubbly, enthusiastic proponent of this common framework thing for one big reason.
Oh,
That is, China, India, Gulf states were at the table, right? And
right.
in a world where in some of the most vulnerable countries, the Paris Club is like scraping to mid-single digits as a percentage of total debt exposure.
Yeah, there's loads of reasons why, but they certainly have lost relevance.
That's it, right? And I definitely wouldn't want to take this as, hey, time to lend again so you have more control over the countries, right? That's not the point. But in a world where some of the traditional lenders are a very small and shrinking part of the picture, the fact that stakeholders that are a very big and growing part of the picture, although I guess China is shrinking to some extent, but are that to me was just worth an enormous amount. And I was not upset about the lack of formality. That's just kind of par for the course in this world. And even if you have formality, this is back to our conversation about contracts, But in a world where the stakeholders at the table are not necessarily invested in the procedures that this table is used to function by, right? So sort of all
no, there's a reason why they didn't join the Paris Club.
Precisely, right?
And this is my problem with it, is that there just seems to be not the recognition that Paris Club didn't expand to include all of these lenders for a reason. So therefore, cutting and pasting the kind of procedures, secretariat, and everything else onto the new didn't really lend itself to, it didn't really lead to perhaps a different or better outcome. So I think, and then I think the private sector, because as you say, the traditional lenders have been decreasing, and we've had the rise of these non-traditional lenders, but we've also had the rise of private sector markets, and we haven't figured out how to bring them in effectively into the conversation.
So agreed. And on the private sector side also, we had been so fixated on one kind of an instrument and one clause, hashtag CACs bless their heart, right? For, 25 years, really, international architecture was so much about majority amendment clauses in bonds that, we didn't really give much thought to anything from negative pledge to the structure of syndicated lending and presence of enormous actors like commodity trading firms that are half the debt in countries, right?
Exactly.
And who are not regulated, certainly not in the same way, and who may or may not care less about anybody's views on standard form contracts. So I think that you've exactly hit the nail on the head, Jill. And that is, you have stakeholders who were not part of the old process for a reason, who do not feel particularly invested in that process. So they wouldn't necessarily do anything for the sake, for old time's sake. You have actors that are not coordinating along multiple dimensions day to day, right? So, on Monday you have dinner about interest rates, and on Tuesday you have lunch about Chad, right? I mean, that's not the world that the coordination universe we're in. And going back to something we started with, we have a world where the people at the table are literally speaking different languages, right?
Exactly.
You and I have seen this in interdisciplinary gatherings, at mixed gatherings. It takes a lot to just get people to recognize that, what a European means by a bank and what an American means by a bank is two different banks.
Exactly.
So it's not a surprise, but what I'm concerned about is that there doesn't seem to have been enough recognition of that fact. And there was just this assumption that, well, now that we have a shingle common framework, we're just going to keep talking and somehow things are going to turn out okay. I'm being unfair to many of our friends who are working their tails off to do the right thing. But I feel like
no, and I think to be fair to them, it was a great start and it was a great intention. And now the hard work begins. I think to kind of try to put a positive spin on it, it was a wonderful step to say, okay, we need to move to something new. Here's a G20 forum that, at least at that moment, was functioning. And, there was the need for speed because of the pandemic. So they did quite quickly just kind of pull from a rule book that they kind of had lying around. But I think now, what is it now, 2 years later, right? I mean, 2020, yeah, that we need to step back and say, okay, what is this really going to look like going forward, and who really are those new stakeholders around the table, and how do we bring all of this kind of forward together into kind of a new world? And I feel passionate, as you know, if you've been listening to this podcast, how do we layer in some other global agendas? I've been talking about climate change lately. Food security, I think, would be put on there. There's a lot of other global challenges that we could perhaps try to kind of weave together into an interesting way of kind of giving countries real support and real frameworks for addressing sovereign debt distress and other issues.
And you're so just I want to really, really highlight and just put lots of stars and sort of sparkles around what you just said.
No, well, thank you.
Well, no, I mean, really, the point is that people need to live and people need to eat, right?
Exactly.
Whether you do this with a debt contract clause or with a giant transfer or with some other tool, that's a means, right? So we're kind of often losing. International coordination is a means to an end, and the end is human flourishing, human dignity, no
right, human rights. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, and so I think that's what we've got to be nimble enough to recognize and accommodate. And look, on the bright side, right? I just described a terrible race to the bottom where everybody wants, stumble over themselves to claim collateral and basically dismember a country. On the bright side, if all of this results in everybody stumbling all over themselves to, give money to the most vulnerable country as cheaply as possible, without exacerbating their debt burdens or tying up their resources, that's a great kind of competition, right? Like,
right.
So that really would be, I'm hoping for a virtuous cycle, not a, vicious cycle. But, obviously it's been a couple of years to keep hope alive.
I know, but we're trying to look for those virtuous cycles where we can, and this is where, as much as I've been out there criticizing the common framework and everything, I am trying to change my tune somewhat and say, okay, well, it's a great first step, and now let's just really run with it and make it better.
Amen. So, I mean, we need more accountability there, right? I mean, this is in a world that's no longer a little club. I think more formality, more transparency, more accountability, more expectation setting is in order, right?
And what you said, also more understanding of each other. So I think, to go back to our original thing, if we can dial down kind of the political, mudslinging on some of this and actually try to understand, well, how can we work with what we've got? I don't know. So Anna, one of my kind of things at the end of a podcast is to let the guests have the last word. And I usually ask them to give some advice. Normally, and I think based on the numbers and where this podcast has been downloaded all over the world at this point, I think we're being listened to by quite a few debt managers out there. And what advice would you give to them, either if they're needing to negotiate with a Chinese entity or if they're needing indeed to restructure with a Chinese entity? How is there any parting words of advice that you would give to our listeners?
So I want to give a caveat that I should have given at the outset, which is that I'm not a China specialist at all, right? So this is literally. Sometimes
you stumble into expertise.
So this is my expertise, sort of what you saw in those 100 contracts, right? So I know how to read debt contracts. I'm pretty comfortable with claiming that.
No, I know. And I know I'm supposed to be the sovereign advisor. So I'm trying to maybe I'm just trying to pick your brain so I have some free advice.
This is all to say that the advice I would have is really much more general, although it certainly comes out of the experience with this project and, but also some of the others. When somebody tells you that just sign this, these terms are standard, never, ever, ever, ever take that on faith. You've got to, if it takes looking at our database, terrific. All of these contracts are posted, but there are other countries. The Philippines started posting all of their debt contracts in 2020. And so you're going to see a lot of these lenders' terms all around, right? Mm-hmm. Ask your advisors. Sorry, gosh, I didn't mean to give you homework, right?
No, that's good.
Just ask them.
I like to work.
Ask your advisors, is this really normal?
Right.
And everything is negotiable, right? So the carve out from the confidentiality clause that we spend some time with, that's a valuable carve out, right? Have some. And having domestic accountability can help you with international negotiations. So I'd say, standard doesn't mean standard. That's my top bit of advice in contract negotiations. And then my other one is, negotiations are called negotiations for a reason. And there are a lot of folks who want your business, Madam Debt Manager. So,
you can stand up and be tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
So there you go. I don't know.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. Thank you for being on the podcast. And we'll have you back for sure.
It's such a pleasure. And I'm delighted. Really. Thank you so much, Jill.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.